Welcome, and today we are talking about post-biblical literature, which, if that reminds you of post-serial, that's actually not what we're going for. What it means is writings that came after the Bible, and we're referring to the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, and other non-canonical writings. Here's actually our lesson outline for today. What does canon mean? We'll be talking about that. Also, the definitions and examples of certain kinds of post-biblical literature, like the kinds we already discussed. The content, divisions, and major themes of post-biblical, non-canonical literature. Evangelism as a major theme, and also results of Jewish missionary literature, which did exist. Actually, much of the New Testament is Jewish missionary literature. But there are other documents that Jews used to win over pagans to biblical religion that are outside of the New Testament, and we'll be looking at those. So what is a canon? Well, we're not talking about a centuries-old artillery unit called a Canon, and we're not talking about the Canon EOS 40D camera, and sorry, Nick Cannon, we're not talking about you either. What we're actually talking about is something that can be defined in this way. It is an authoritative list of books accepted as Holy Scripture. It is the authentic works of a writer. It is sanctioned or accepted by a group of people, or it is a body of related works. It's an accepted principle or rule. It's a criterion or standard of judgment. It's a body of principles, rules, standards, or norms. That's kind of the dictionary definition of canon. For example, the Mosaic canon refers to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The Pauline canon refers to the true epistles of Paul. The Johannine canon refers to John's true epistles. 1st and 2nd Hezekiah Jr. are not part of the biblical canon. Why? Because I just made them up. And they're not authoritative. There's no authoritative authorship because it's written by me. And who am I? Who cares what I wrote? 1st and 2nd Hezekiah Jr. I mean, they're fine books, but why should you accept them? And they're not generally beneficial because they're imaginary. So they need to be generally beneficial for people. They need to be written by people who actually matter, not nobodies. And the date of authorship needs to be in line with the other scriptures. So that's, for example, why we can't write something today and put it in the Bible, because it's too late. It's not written by anybody who matters in a biblical context. And it's not necessarily generally beneficial. If it is generally beneficial, though, and it's written by someone who is a credible teacher, it might be good to use, but we can't put it in the Bible. It might even be 100% true, but we can't put it in the Bible, because the Bible has already been sealed and determined. Now, introduction to the Apocrypha. Now, some of you have probably heard of the Apocrypha, especially if you're Catholic. You already know what the Apocrypha is. You probably don't refer to it as the Apocrypha, but you probably know nonetheless what it is. Apocrypha literally means the hidden away texts, or the concealed texts. Apo, meaning away from, and kryptein, meaning to hide away. Literally, the hidden away texts. Also, the word kryptein is related to the word kryptos, which is where we get the word cryptic, or hidden, implying the true meaning was hidden from common people, and thus they were texts which were to be hidden away. Because if the common people get a hold of these texts, they might misinterpret them, they might start believing or practicing heresies, which we don't want to do. In 4th Esdras, it says, this is an apocryphal work. It's not in the Bible, but some people accept it. God supposedly says the following: make public the 24 books that you wrote first, and let the worthy and the unworthy read them, but keep the 70 that were written last, in order to give them to the wise among your people. So it's kind of alluding to this concept that a few books are for the public, but there's other books with hidden wisdom that only wise and educated people should be learning, not country folk. The Apocrypha is also sometimes referred to as the Deuterocanon, which, the name Deuteronomy, that literally means two or second. Nomos means law. It's the second giving of the law. In other words, the Torah is repeated in the book of Deuteronomy. So the Deuterocanon is the second canon. There's the biblical canon, and then there's the second canon. It was written after the sealing of the canon by the rabbis. So basically, the Apocrypha, although it is used by hundreds of thousands of people today, mostly Catholics and Orthodox Christians, these are books that didn't make it into the Bible because they were written too late. The rabbis had collected certain books, and they put them all in one collection, and they called it the Bible. And after that, they said, here's the cutoff date. If we find any more writings, they might still be good, they might still be authoritative, and we can still use them, but we can't add them to this collection called the Bible. We can add them to another collection, and they can still be fine, they're still good, but they're not biblical in the sense that they don't belong in the Bible. So, the Deuterocanon, or the Apocrypha, didn't make it into the Bible, and despite this, it's included in many Christian Bibles until the Protestant Reformation, when many Protestants threw it out of the Bible. Now again, doesn't mean that it's bad, it just means that it's misplaced. Some examples of the Apocrypha books, they were written between the 220s and 100s BC. They include books like the Book of Tobit, Ecclesiasticus, or sometimes it's referred to as Sirach, not Sriracha, Sirach, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which we have a little bit of exposure to. We've talked about that a little bit. The Wisdom of Solomon, which I'm a fan of, and also the Sirach. Bel and the Dragon, which are the additions to Daniel, according to some people. The Prayer of Manasseh, and also 3rd and 4th Ezra. 1st and 2nd Ezra are considered the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. If that's confusing, I don't blame you. It's confusing to me too. Then there is also a group of books called the Pseudepigrapha. It has nothing to do with pigs, but it has everything to do with what these words mean. Where pseudo means false, kind of like pseudoscience means fake science, right? Epi means upon, and graphia means writing. So pseudo-epigraphia, or pseudepigrapha, means lies upon the writings, or just simply false writings. A writing that alleges to be written by someone else, but is almost certainly not written by the alleged person, is the kind of book that we're talking about. And the best example that I can think of is the Book of Enoch, otherwise called First Enoch, which was certainly not written by Enoch himself. Rather, an imaginative writer took Enoch's reputation, his name, and stuck it onto his own writing to give the book credibility. So basically, when people found out, oh, Enoch wrote this book, it must be true. Basically, they lied about who wrote it. Now, this was actually a somewhat common practice back in the day, and it was not looked down upon like how we would look down upon it today. Nonetheless, Enoch didn't actually write it. Now, certain pseudepigraphal writings would stress from around the year 300 BC, around the time of Alexander the Great, up until the 100s, so a few decades before Yeshua was born. Some of these include the life of Adam and Eve, which were not actually written by Adam and Eve. The first book of Enoch, which was not actually written by Enoch. The Assumption of Moses, the Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Abraham, and possibly the letter of Aristeas. So, for example, the Apocalypse of Abraham was not actually written by Abraham. But that's what these books claim to be. They're mysterious books that were very attractive to some people because they thought, oh, these are ancient wisdom. These are books of ancient wisdom. It was actually modern wisdom that was credited back to people who were long dead. So, what are some common themes in these books? Well, some of these common themes are the Jews as an ancient or advanced, stable race. To the ancients, if something... Let me clarify. People at this time, they saw ancient things as better than new things. In fact, we'll see this once we start talking about the Romans, where ancient things were seen as good because they were seen to be time-tested and stable. And because of this, the Jews were seen as this kind of people. The Jews were also framed as a philosophical or spiritual leader of humanity. That they were the role models in terms of ethical, philosophical, spiritual guidance. Also, the Jews and their God as military champions. How they had overcome the Greeks with the Maccabees, remember? How the Maccabees had overcome the giant Greek power from the north. And also, instances such as God's destruction of the Egyptians at the Red Sea, and things like this. It's basically propaganda. It's true, but it's truth with a point, truth with a goal, propaganda, where they're telling people this to increase the renown of the Jewish people to gain some respect for once. And while their intentions might have been good, sometimes it didn't always happen. Also, the Jews as anti-Hellenistic propagandists, as I kind of mentioned before, and also the Jews as a light to the Gentiles. So basically, certain Jewish writings were written to convert Gentiles to the biblical way and to abandon Hellenism, to abandon paganism, to abandon their old ways, and to embrace God's ways. Also, something that was actually admired about the Jewish people was their prophetic knowledge. They were actually respected for this. They were considered people who had their fingers on the pulse of the universe, so to speak, where they knew what was going to happen. And so sometimes people would consult them for prophetic knowledge. So conversion or proselytory themes in post-biblical literature. Sometimes people crafted stories about famous figures to appeal to Gentiles and promote Jewish values. For example, in the letter of Aristeas, which was written in the mid to early 200s, so about 2.5 centuries or more before Jesus was born, Aristeas is the assistant to Ptolemy, which we all remember Ptolemy asked for the Bible to be translated into Greek so he could put it in the Library of Alexandria. Aristeas, who is the assistant to Ptolemy, writes home about Jewish practices and rituals and beliefs. The earliest known source is this, and it describes the tefillin, the mezuzot, and the tzitzit. Remember, bind them to your arm, put it on your door, put the tassels on your garments. That's what we're talking about. Now, whether this figure actually ever existed in real life doesn't actually matter, because the very fact that these practices were written about at this time shows us that these practices are at least that old. So for our purposes, it doesn't actually matter. For people who are studying different aspects of it, it might matter. There's also the story of Bel and the Dragon, which claims to be an addition to the Book of Daniel, even though it was written within a century before Jesus was born. And the Book of Daniel was written many centuries before he was born. So with reason, with this kind of logical, philosophical mindset, Daniel explains that the pagan priests were frauds. And long story short, he actually invents a concoction, which is basically a bomb, and he feeds it to the dragon, and it kills the dragon. And this was a dragon that the Babylonians had worshipped as a deity, as a god. And once Daniel blows up the dragon, uh, I'm sorry I'm laughing. It's kind of comical. At least I think it's comical. I think it's also a fun story too. So I do suggest reading it, but I don't suggest believing it, if that makes sense. I think it's a fun read. Anyways, Nebuchadnezzar praises God once Daniel blows up the dragon, and his associates fear that Nebuchadnezzar has become a Jew. Oh no, Daniel's blown up the dragon, and Nebuchadnezzar is now praising the Jewish God. He's gonna be a Jew. This is the worst thing in the world. Kind of like with what people say today. Oh, it's the worst thing in the world. Uh, the book of Joseph and Asenath, who, again, this was actually around the time that Yeshua was around. Asenath is an Egyptian priestess who eventually falls in love with the biblical character of Joseph, and she repents of her sins after falling in love with the ever-romantic Joseph, of which nothing is said in the Bible. But again, this is a story. And ultimately, she converts to biblical monotheism. So she abandons her pagan ways and she embraces the one God of the Bible. We also see Josephus writing a piece called Contra Apion, or Against Apion. Apion is a guy. And he says, "A Jew conversed with us and many other philosophical persons and made a trial of our skill in philosophy, and as he had lived with many learned men, he communicated to us more information than he received from us." And Josephus says that this is supposedly the words of Aristotle. Now, was it actually from Aristotle? Probably not. But he's trying to make a point. Maybe Josephus had heard of this legend, and he says, this would be great to put in my book because I'm trying to convert Gentiles to the Bible and to leave their other gods, their other religions. And so if a former pagan like Aristotle can become a Jew, why can't you? It's the best advertising program you can have. Aristotle's this big Hellenistic guy, and he becomes a Jew. You should too. Then there's also Josephus's discourse concerning Hades. It's part 7. And he says, and now if you Gentiles be persuaded, and leave your vain imaginations about your pedigrees and your gaining riches and philosophy, and if you apply your ears to the hearing of the inspired prophets, the interpreters, both of God and his word, and will believe in God, and you shall both be partakers of these things, referring to paradise earlier, and obtain the good things that are to come, you shall see the ascent into the immense heaven. So basically, if you give up paganism, if you stop being a Hellenist, and you accept the Bible, you'll go to heaven. That's kind of what Josephus is saying. Now, we see other post-biblical literature in the book of Acts. The book of Acts was written long after the Bible was put together by the rabbis. In fact, it was put together almost 500 years after the Bible had been completed and sealed. But we find this story, and Paul, interestingly enough, is saying very similar things to what these other books and what Josephus himself was saying. It says, "So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, he is Lord of heaven and earth.' Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead," which Paul had explained, I cut that out for the sake of time, "but when they had heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer. But others said, 'We shall hear you again concerning this.'" Basically, we want to get some time to think about this. Maybe come back tomorrow or next week. We'll talk about this at some other time. So Paul went out of their midst. But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, meaning this is somebody who probably went to the Areopagus often, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So basically, Paul's walking through the city, and he sees an idol, and the little plaque at the bottom of the idol says, "To an unknown God." How on earth is Paul going to know that that's the God of the universe? Really, Paul? The thing is that he doesn't. He doesn't. And he's basically, and I don't mean for this to sound bad, I know it's going to probably sound bad, but it's not. He's basically making something up. He has no proof that this is actually for the God of the Bible. But he's using this to make a point. He says, look, you're very religious people. You're so religious, you're honoring gods, you don't even know their names. Let me tell you about the true unknown God, the true God that you don't know about. You have an idol for some unknown God, I don't know who it is, but there's another God that you also don't know about, and he is the God of the universe. And some people believe him. And they come and they accept biblical religion. And so this is Paul using this kind of approach with the pagans. We also have the account of Seneca the Younger in his book De Superstitione. He's a Roman, and he is writing this in the 1st century. So actually during the time that the New Testament is being written. He says the customs, he's writing about the Jews, the customs of this accursed race have gained such influence that they are now received throughout the whole world. The vanquished, the Jews, have given laws to their victors, the Romans. So basically the Romans conquered Judea, but the Jews are conquering the Roman people through their religion. I think it's funny. These pagan accounts of Judaism's success, I think, are funny because they always make it sound like it's the worst thing in the world, which, as pagans, they believe that. But from our perspective, coming to know the God of the Bible is the whole point. That's what we want, right? And so, Juvenal, who is a satirist, he's kind of a comedian in the 1st century, he says in his book called Satires, he says, "Some who have had a father who reveres the Sabbath worship nothing but the clouds, and see no difference between eating swine's flesh and that of a man." So basically, eating pork is just as bad as eating a human being. And in time, they take to circumcision. Oh no, it's the worst thing in the world. Having been wont to flout the laws of Rome, they learn and practice and revere the Jewish law. Oh no, it's the end of the world. So basically, Juvenal, which is not juvenile, like childish, it's a person's name, Juvenal. He says that there are some Gentiles who take on certain Jewish practices. They accept the Sabbath. They don't worship idols. They don't eat pig. And they eventually go a step further and get circumcised. We actually see these people all over the New Testament. They're called God-fearers. But we will be leaving that for another day. So, today actually went by pretty quick. I'm glad that we're not taking too much of your time. These are just some things about the non-canonical post-biblical literature that existed from mostly from the 200s and the 100s BCE. I don't think that we're going to be covering the non-canonical literature after the time of Jesus, but we might reference it from time to time. Anyways, I hope you have a wonderful day, a beautiful day in fact, and be good to one another, and maybe even smile at someone today.